What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the vlog. In this episode, I am talking about the Canon R5 again, amazingly, or apparently, or something like that. So, this would be Friday or Saturday, so March 13th or 14th, I think it was 13th. Canon Australia confirmed some more details about the EOS R5 that we sort of already knew some of them, and some of them are new information. And again, I just continue to sort of find things that make me a little bit more and more excited about this camera. Last year, well, it's funny because in 2016, when the EOS 5D Mark IV came out, my position had been basically like, if they'd have sold this as a mirrorless camera, just straight up the way it was, I'd have bought it. And then the EOS R came out the following year, something like that, and at that point I had already gone to Yellowstone, I've gotten back in doing some wildlife photography, and was just completely underwhelmed by the R as a replacement for my 5D Mark IV. Of course, it shares the same sensor as the 5D Mark IV, so it's basically got the same performance as the 5D Mark IV, and not having feature parity, I really felt like, well, why would I get an R? It's a step backwards from my 5D Mark IV. I mean, yeah, okay, it's smaller and lighter, but that's not necessarily that important to me over, you know, feature parity or better features. So the R5, as I've said in previous videos, is something I'm really excited about. It's an EOS, a mirrorless camera from Canon, EOS. I continue to stick with Canon because I like the thought process, the way their cameras work. I don't have... it's something I've not found pretty much anywhere else on any other brand. I always find like when I've used Nikon cameras, I've always found that I've struggled to deal with the user interface and the way controls are set up and the way the camera works, and it does things that just don't work the way I think they should work, or the way my thought process, my mental model is structured. And so again, I've been sticking with Canon, but like for the last maybe 5 or 6 years at least, camera gear hasn't been that big of a thing for me. It's important, obviously, as a photographer and now as somebody who's doing a lot more video content, but it's a tool, and I've had a real hard time getting excited about a tool, regardless brand. Nobody has introduced Sony, Nikon, Panasonic, etc. Nobody has brought anything to market camera-wise where I've kind of found myself going, wow, I'm excited about this. Well, that's nice, or that would have been nice to have in my camera, or that's a nice upgrade. I mean, I jumped on the 5D Mark IV right out of the gate because it was a solid upgrade from my Mark III, but I haven't really sort of had that burning desire for new gear for a while, and so I'm kind of excited about the R5. I'm also kind of nervous about the whole situation right now where, due to supply shortages from the coronavirus and China's quarantining of stuff and interrupting of shipping and so forth, Canon isn't producing the cameras at the rate that they were expecting to produce the cameras because they're having supply shortages and they have factories shut down. And there has been apparently some talk in Canon about, you know, from what I've gathered from reading in the rumor mills, that the camera was supposed to release before the Summer Olympics in on July 24th. And now there's talk, apparently there's a debate going on whether they should release the camera on schedule but without the volume to back the demand, or hold the release until October or something in that range so that they have the volume to back the demand. Now, I don't think Canon's going to have the volume to back the demand, period. I think this is going to be a 5D Mark II situation. I think it doesn't matter how much production Canon has cranking out cameras, they're not going to be able to crank out the camera, and the camera is going to be essentially a scarce item well into next year, regardless of what happens with delays or delayed production. I just think that as things stand right now, it'll be the first 8K capable camera on the market that doesn't cost $60,000+ as a cinema camera, and that I think is going to be a huge thing for a lot of video people, a lot of cinematographers, regardless, whether the specs are cut down. I don't think it matters at that point if it's not 12-bit RAW or 14-bit RAW video or some crazy thing like that. Just having 8K at 8 to 10 bits, probably 10 bits. I mean, we can look at what the Canon's done with the 1DX Mark III, and I think a lot of what Canon did there is going to trickle back into, or is going to be in the 5D Mark II, so, or the EOS R5. So I think we're going to see 10-bit H.265 422 color space. Even though Canon hasn't announced this stuff, I think Canon would be absolutely foolish to only put, say, 8-bit 420 H.264 capabilities in this camera when they've demonstrated that they have much better capabilities. The processor should have much better capabilities, certainly H.265 in the 1DX. And I don't think, and I've said this before when I've talked about the EOS R5, I don't think Canon needs to worry or should worry all that much about the R5 undercutting the 1DX or outperforming the 1DX in many respects, because the 1DX is, well, first of all, the 1DX is a niche product. It only sells to essentially very high-end sports photographers and like action photographers. It's not the everybody camera. Second of all, it's probably the last 1DX DSLR Canon makes. The DSLRs are very clearly, their days as the de facto standard for camera design are numbered. And more importantly, I think Canon needs to demonstrate to the people who would be buying a 1D or a 1R, that mirrorless replacement for the 1DX, that yes, mirrorless cameras in fact have beyond or equal or better what a DSLR could do. And doing that in a 5D or a 5R now doesn't preclude them from doing more in a 1R next year or the following year. It's just like the worst case scenario is it hurts sales of an already niche camera, but, and I've said this before, I have a very strong feeling that when it comes to camera sales, they spike very heavily in the first maybe 6 months, if that, of the camera's life, and then they taper off considerably. And I would not be surprised if the vast majority of the professional photographers who are going to buy 1DX Mark IIIs have already bought their 1DX Mark IIIs, and the remaining sales for the life of that camera are going to be much, much, much reduced. But anyway, going back to talking about what Canon Australia confirmed in a press release, which I thought was rather amusing, because they made a point in the press release of that they were countering the, so, Canon had the development announcement where they said 8K video, etc., and Canon Australia was countering the perception that pre-announcement, development announcement was a fantasy of Canon's. And I thought this was hilarious when I read it, because, I mean, either that's just marketing intro stuff, or there are some people who don't actually understand truth in advertising, and that a company coming out and saying that they're developing this product that's supposed to release this year, which really tells us that the product's basically developed. The simple reality of production and the time it takes for manufacturing, like Canon doesn't make 1 million cameras a day. If they need to make, I wouldn't be surprised if they were making maybe mid-hundreds of cameras a day. Certainly, probably not low thousands, but that would be within the realm of possibility, is mid-hundreds to low thousands. If they need, and I wouldn't be surprised, to be perfectly honest, if the number was more like 200 or 300 cameras a day, even for a mirrorless. If they're looking at possibly having, say, 100,000 cameras globally at release, that would be at, say, 250 cameras a day. That would be 4 days for 1,000 cameras, 40 days for 10,000 cameras, 400 days for 100,000 cameras. So, they'd have to be doing more than 250. The point is that the camera's already, the engineering's done, the product is settled, it is all tooling up for manufacturing, especially now in March. If the original ship date was supposed to be July 24th, you can figure between 2 weeks and a month of that is, would be taken up just in shipping. Put the cameras in a container, put them on a boat, and ship them to the various destinations around the world. I guess they could air freight, but air freight is really expensive for something when you're doing it where when your expected release date is. And so, like, the end of June, the second half of June and all of July, again, we're going to just assume for a second that the release date was July 24th. The second half of June and all of July, or the first 24 days of July, and at least the second half of June, if not all of June, would just be shipping. Anything that has to be, or that is expected to be on store shelves, had to be shipped before the middle of June. So we're in the middle of March, which leaves April and May. You can't change things at this point. The sensor's been done. The sensor was finished sometime probably 2 years ago, 1.5 to 2 years ago. The electronics are done. They were finished probably last year. The software is probably done. That's about the only thing that could really be changed late into the process, and I don't see that changing in a way that isn't a sort of shortly after release firmware update. That's just the reality. This is the reality of manufacturing and production. Not that I have personal experience in this, but that in the research that I've done, the simple thing is they're not cranking, they didn't in February or January when they first announced the development of this camera. They weren't guessing at where they were hoping to be. Canon already had a product in hand. There may have been some final tweaks that they were making to that product at that point, but it was done. The stuff was gearing up for manufacture at that point, full-on manufacture, if it hadn't already been geared up to full-on manufacture. So the idea that Canon would come out and make an announcement that they had this 8K camera coming, and it had a 20 frame per second electronic shutter and a 12 frame per second mechanical shutter, which shouldn't be surprising because the 1DX Mark III does that. That's in the field now, and it's demonstrable that it does what the box says, that it has those capabilities. So having them in another camera isn't exactly unreasonable or fantasy, but that Canon Australia felt that there was enough people that thought Canon's announcement of the product that they were making was a fantasy, or that the features that product contained was a fantasy, just to me is laughable at best. But anyway, Canon Australia put out this press release, and they've confirmed some things and they've reiterated some things. And So I'm going to just kind of run down what they've reiterated, what we knew already, and so on and so forth. So they confirmed that the sensor, it was the 8K video is full sensor size. It's not a crop. Well, of course, it's full sensor size and not a crop. 8K, like, I've seen people sort of, in some of the articles I've seen talking about this after the Canon Australia press release, it seems like people are a little confused because they talk about how, well, like the 5D Mark IV has a 4K crop. Well, the reason the 5D Mark IV has a 4K crop is that there isn't the sensor isn't high enough resolution at 30 megapixels to record 8K. And either the readouts and or the demosaic and downsampling hardware in the Digic processor in the 5D Mark IV isn't capable of either reading out the sensor at the full 30 megapixels and then downsampling it to 4K, or downsampling it to 4K. There's a limitation in there. And so the solution to shooting 4K video with a 5D Mark IV sensor or a 1DX Mark II sensor is a crop. You window in on the sensor, and it's a crop in the sense that the image area being recorded isn't the full sensor, but it probably is better to think about it as a window where instead of recording with line skipping or downsampling or some other mechanism to get like the 1080p video, it's going to a pixel equals a pixel, and it's a 4096 pixel wide by 2140 pixel tall window in the middle of the sensor that is what's being used to produce the 4K video on a 5D Mark IV. And this is sort of the response that the only really response that you can have when you can't read out, say, 30 megapixels or roughly almost 30 megapixels fast enough, or downsample it fast enough in hardware to produce video from that. Well, 8K is 35 megapixels. The reason, or yeah, 35 megapixels. And the reason that we kind of are estimating, or are pretty sure, or almost 100% sure, that the resolution of the sensor is 45 megapixels is that if you convert from an 8K DCI frame to a 3:2 aspect ratio still image, you come up with 45 megapixels. And so the only way that makes any sense to produce or to shoot, or however you want to phrase that, is to not window. You have to record pixel for pixel the whole thing, because 8K is that much resolution, which also makes it sort of pointless in so many respects when it comes to video, but that's an argument for another video, I think. So we know that the 8K video is going to be full sensor. The question is what Canon ends up doing at 4K and 1080p. I hope that what they end up doing is that they either, more than likely, they'll have to do something with maybe line skipping. Depends on how fast they can actually read out the sensor, or binning of some sort. It depends on how fast they can actually read out the sensor to get the video. But hopefully what this actually means is that 4K and 1080p will be potentially downsampled full 8K video. So the camera pulls the 8K frame from the sensor, then downsamples it either to 4K or 1080p. That would be preferable. What would be less preferable is binning would be okay. What would really be not preferable is sort of line skipping. Presumably, if Canon has the bandwidth and processing power in the camera to do 8K at 30 frames per second, debayered in whole 9 yards, they should have the processing power in the camera to do downsampling. Of course, the 1DX, again, since it's already on the market and it's already using a very similar processor, is doing, I believe, downsampling. I could be wrong. for their 4K and 1080p video, and it's full sensor area for that too. So, you know, that's a good indication, I think, of what we should expect to see in the R5. Canon Australia also confirmed 30 frames per second at 8K. Presumably it'll do 24 frames a second. That doesn't really tell us about frame rates at 4K. Canon Rumors is suggesting 60 or 120 frames a second. I don't really know. Presumably, if you have the processing power and read bandwidth to pull 8K at 30 frames a second, then you should certainly be able to pull a at least binned or line skipped 4K at, or windowed 4K at 120 frames a second. But that might actually not be entirely possible either. But, you know, again, we kind of look at the 1DX Mark III, but we also have to remember there's a lot more pixels that have to be dealt with. And so how that all plays out, read times don't just disappear instantaneously, but they're also super quick generally anyway. So, you know, that could be either way, but that's something they didn't confirm. And they confirmed that all dual pixel AF modes will be supported when it's shooting 8K video at up to up to 30 frames a second. So basically, we'll have autofocus at 30 or at 8K, which is, in my opinion, frickin' awesome. It frustrates the heck out of me as a lone wolf photographer or videographer to not have autofocus. I can't always, like when I'm doing these videos, I can't always be behind the camera. And not that I'm planning on shooting, like, you know, something where I'm in front of the camera presenting at 8K anytime soon, but that's certainly something that I think is super beneficial, especially because, again, and I said this in a previous video, shooting at 8K, you get a 35 megapixel frame. That's enough to make a print from, which is enough to essentially use the 8K video as a 30 frame per second tracking still, where you just pull the frame you want out, kind of like you can do on the 5D Mark IV in, or the 1DX Mark II, kind of like where you can pull an individual frame out and save it as a JPEG. You'd be able to potentially be able to do that, whether it's built into the camera or not, actually, because you could always do it in an NLE. But you'd be able to do that at 8K with getting a 35 megapixel still. I think it ends up being like a 30 megapixel still if you crop it to 3:2 aspect ratio, which gives you, like, you know, a tremendously powerful tool for, say, wildlife photography or sports photography or something, because you can track full motion, full autofocus, etc., and then pull exactly the frame you want out at, you know, like 30 frames a second. Or, you know, if you want 4K, if 4K is good enough, you potentially can be shooting that at 120 frames a second, which is just kind of, you know, again, not a confirmed number, but potentially, which is just kind of crazy performance. So that was what they confirmed about the video stuff. They also confirmed that in-body image stabilization will be in the camera. I think that was confirmed in the first one, in the development announcement, but they also confirmed that it will work in conjunction with in-lens image stabilization. So potentially any lens that you have that's image stabilized, you get even more stabilization with the in-body image stabilization too. And of course, in-body image stabilization can do something that in-lens image stabilization can't, which is correct for roll in the camera, you know, in your shake or motion, because rolling a lens element doesn't do anything to roll the picture, but rolling the sensor can keep it level. So that was confirmed. That also, though, raised the big question in my mind, which is, they didn't mention whether that was, or whether that applied to only RF lenses or if it applies to RF and EF lenses. Presumably, you know, this is where it gets complicated, that does the camera need to know or talk to or have an interaction with the image stabilizer in the lens? in which case it would need to have that higher speed RF bus to connect to the lens to be able to synchronize systems, or can the two do this, can the in-body stabilizer work independent of the in-lens stabilizer, potentially even maybe at reduced capabilities or something, to allow you to, say, mount an adapted EF lens with image stabilization and shoot with that and get the at least some of, if not all of, the benefits of the dual image stabilizers. That wasn't confirmed, or that wasn't something that was brought up, but that was the thought that I went through my mind when I started reading that they were talking about dual image stabilization, or confirming dual image stabilization. And the final thing that they were talking about is autofocus subject detection. And Canon Australia is saying that the cameras will have body, head, face, and eye tracking, both for people and, quote, dogs, cats, and birds. Now, I don't know. This, to me, raised a whole bunch of questions about the whole AI machine learning, image autofocus tracking and identification. That machine learning systems are only as good as the data sets that they're fed. And if all Canon is feeding the camera is dogs, cats, and birds, then what about all the other stuff that's out there? Now, obviously, people are, as much as people differ in skin color and sort of shape and size, etc., there's a lot of there's a great deal of similarity. A short, well, I mean, it doesn't really matter, because, like, you could pick any two people and there's far more in common between two people of the most divergent physical sort of physical appearances than there is between, say, a dog, a bird, and a snake. Completely different cups of tea. And so machine learning for face, head, etc. detection, I mean, that's great in theory, but the question I find myself kind of coming back to and asking is, so how does that help me as a wildlife photographer? Obviously, that's a niche compared to, say, people who shoot to photograph humans. That's probably a dominant use case. But when it talks about cat detection, when Canon Australia was talking about cat detection, does that apply to cheetahs and lions and tigers, or does it only detect house cats? Like, with dogs, does that apply to dingoes and coyotes and wolves, or just, and what, maybe even foxes, or is it just domestic dogs? I don't know. Like, this is where the whole machine learning thing, it might work, it might not work. Birds, is that, birds are a little more uniform across the board, but even then, there's differences in, coloration that can be pretty substantial in terms of cameras trying to figure things out. And then, of course, that raises, like I said, the question, as a wildlife photographer, what about, bears and bison and elk and moose and elephants and hippopotamuses and, all of these things. And this sort of raises an important consideration and question for me, because I've talked about in previous videos, and I did a video on how I set up dual rear button focusing on my 5D Mark IVs. And, I said in that video that just switching or getting rid of a mirror, just, going from DSLR to mirrorless, doesn't change the demands on me as a photographer. I still want or need to be able to tell the camera to focus where I want the camera to focus. And they haven't confirmed or denied. We don't know at all whether dual button focusing will be available on the R5. It wasn't available on the regular, on the first generation EOS R or the RP, but then it's also not available on the 6D Mark II, and the EOS R is more akin to the 6D Mark II than it is to the 5D Mark IV, even though they share the same sensor. But when you look at them in terms of features, it's more of an entry-level camera than that 5D's professional-level camera. And so this is where, like, I have the open question: is the thought process at Canon specifically, but at, like Nikon, Sony, etc., is the thought process that they're working through that, well, I really should just say Canon, I guess, because Nikon and Sony, as far as I know, don't have any dual rear auto button or dual rear button autofocus capabilities. You can't save points and have things move around depending on which button you hit. So it really just comes down to Canon. But is their thought process, you don't need it because we have all of this advanced AI, machine learning, detection, autofocus going on? Or is there going to be that kind of capability, and they're just not talking about it because it's not a big selling point, talking point, because nobody really pays that much attention to it. Whereas, 8K is a huge selling point. Dual rear button focusing and saved autofocus points is just kind of like, one crazy guy on YouTube cares about it, and that's about it. Nobody else really talks about it. So I don't really know where Canon is going to be with that, and so that's an open question. Now, kind of going the flip side on that, potentially they could include something like the where you use your thumb on the screen like they have on the EOS R. They might, or the EOS M5, M6. They might even have that on the EOS R. I'm not sure now. Looking at the pictures of the camera that have leaked, they aren't going to have the 1DX Mark III's slick, slide your finger over it, autofocus adjust switch. It looks like it's a much more traditional switch or joystick, but so that's not going to be a mechanism. So, that's something that remains to be seen. And like I said, that's something that, just from the engineering perspective and thinking about or looking at the engineering perspective, to me, it's a pretty big leap to ask photographers to just accept that the camera will figure out what they actually want to focus on. And I mean, I know a lot of photographers can deal with, moving the focus point around manually or, touch AF. In fact, I was thinking about this. This is one thing that may be very interesting with respect to mirrorless cameras and shooting with very large telephoto lenses. So with my DSLRs, I shoot and my 100 to 400, I shoot viewfinder camera to my eye. However, when you're shooting with, say, a 600 f4 or 500 f4, the lens is big enough that you're kind of putting it on a tripod or monopod, but primarily, predominantly a tripod to start with. And once you put the camera or the lens on a tripod, you open up a bigger opportunity to put the camera in live view mode and just be able to touch the screen where you want the camera to focus and use touch shutter. And I played with this briefly when I had a 600 that I had rented when I was shooting in Yellowstone. There was a couple of times where I basically, instead of trying to cram into an odd angle in the corner of the car, I just put the camera in live view and was totally blown away there by how fast the dual pixel autofocus was, because it was virtually indistinguishable with a 600 f4 a second generation Canon 600 f4. It was virtually indistinguishable in terms of speed from the dual pixel or the regular phase detect autofocus. I mean, there might have been differences, but functionally I hit the autofocus button and the whatever I was focusing on snapped into focus. But presumably with the new sensor, the new camera, the new processor, that should be even more refined and capable. But there's this possibility that I keep thinking of now, where if you're shooting wildlife with a big lens, instead of trying to work crammed through little viewfinder, you sit back and you put the picture up on the screen, and it's still a little picture, but a 3.5 inch or so LCD is definitely bigger than what you see in the viewfinder in that respect, or than what you see in the viewfinder. That not having it, there may be, I said this in last week when I was talking about how I wanted to talk about the user interface, but I realized as I was doing the video that there was differences that were substantial enough that I couldn't be sure how things actually will play out with an EOS R or R5 without actually using one, because there are sort of big mechanical shifts in how things can be done. And this is one of those aspects where there's the potential for a big shift in like how you go about doing wildlife photography with a big lens, where instead of it just being this constant little cramp through the eye thing, it's a more relaxed, visually, like eye strain wise, sort of stepped back slightly looking at a screen. And then if you're looking at a screen with, being able to touch the screen to move the autofocus point, touch shutter, that kind of thing, you might not need, things can change in ways that I can't quite predict just from past experience. So, wow. I was really not planning on running for anywhere near this long to talk about another update on what's come out, or talking about the EOS R5. As I said, I think it should be maybe apparent that because I keep talking about it, that I'm pretty excited about the camera. I do hope Canon releases it sooner rather than later. Even better would be if they just send me one now, but that ain't gonna happen. Like I said, I have run way longer than I had anticipated or intended to for this vlog, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you if you've made it this far. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this at least moderately interesting, this ramble on the camera. If you did, please smash the like button, and if you'd like to see more content on cameras, I'm still working on that Lightroom video. Last week I said I was working on a video for how to set up the new ISO defaults in Lightroom 9.2. I had expected to have that video done this week, and in fact, it is complicated enough and involved enough that I'm still working on the script for that. I hope that'll be next week's video, and I won't be doing another vlog about random thoughts on camera gear again, or the EOS R5 again, because as excited as I am about the camera, it's sort of dominating the vlog right now. But anyway, so I have that coming up if that's your cup of tea, if you use Lightroom. I should say the new ISO defaults are, as a Canon shooter, they're kind of the same story for me, because the old ones and the new ones, it's just a different way of skinning a cat, so to speak, doing the same thing. But if you're a Nikon user and you use auto ISO, the new Lightroom defaults are a massive improvement for you, because Nikon cameras, I've seen all kinds of weird ISOs that I can't figure out where they're getting the number from, or you know, what kind of ISO it is. And the new Lightroom will interpolate values for that. So if you don't have a picture that you've calibrated at ISO 727, or you know, whatever ISO that the camera came up with for that picture, Lightroom will pick the one next ISO below it, the next ISO above it, and figure out what it should be based on your settings in those ISOs, which is a huge thing for auto ISO users that don't where their camera, especially Nikon, but where their camera doesn't use the same ISOs that you normally would select if you're using the manual ISO. So, as I said, thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please smash the thumbs up button or the like button. For more content like this, please subscribe. If you're into written content on camera gear, reviews, and travel, please check out my website at pointsandfocus.com. Again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.